Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen, and I saw a rook endgame that I really enjoyed today, so I figured I would make some coverage of it. This is the third round game from the Gashimov Memorial Tournament between Fabiano Caruana playing white and Magnus Carlsen playing black. The opening of this game was kind of interesting as well because Carlsen played a Stonewall Dutch, as you can probably see by the formation of the pawns there. But so let's pick up the game on the 30th move, where after knight d2, Carlsen is presumably intending to play knight f3 check and pick up the e5 pawn. And there's no way to defend the e5 pawn, so Fabiano decided to exchange his bishop for it. So knight comes to f3, and then chop chop. And now we have an even material rook endgame where black has the this pawn on f3, which is a thorn in white's side, proverbially speaking, because it creates back rank problems for white, taking away the e2 and g2 squares, and presumably black can intensify this by playing rook d2, playing pressure on the f2 pawn, and also with the ability to come behind and pressure the c4 pawn. I mean, if black were to get an outside passed pawn on the c file, in addition to this cramping pressure that he has, white would really be in a lot of trouble. So, well, one drawback of having such a pawn on f3 is that unless it can be defended by another pawn, there's the chance that white will be able to activate his king, bring his king up to g3, and then not only is the king out of danger, but it would put pressure on black's advanced pawn. So there's always some kind of a risk factor when you have a pawn like this, putting cramping pressure on your opponent's position, that he'll be able to eventually redeploy and win the pawn. But Carlsen was not worried about that happening in this game. So Caruana plays h3, creating loot for his king, and also with the natural plan of g4 and bringing the king to g3 to pick up the f3 pawn. What does Carlsen do about this? He plays h5. And, well, what is the point of h5? It'll become evident very quickly here. Fabiano played g4. Let's look at what happens if white just tries to get off his back rank right away. Rook a5, attacking the c5 pawn. And here, the problem is that white will be forced into a passive position almost immediately. Rook d1 check forces king h2, and now rook f1. So this puts pressure on the f2 pawn, and with g2 being unavailable, the king cannot defend f2. If g3 were available, then the king could defend it, but g3 is not open yet. So, I mean, there are two ways that white could play. White could just go totally passive with rook a2, and then rook c1, hitting the c4 pawn. So white then would have to defend that pawn from the side, and then rook c2, hitting the f2 pawn. So you see what's happening here. White is just being driven into passivity. King g1 and then king f7. So now, I mean, it's apparent that both both pieces for black are more active than their counterparts. Black is just going to bring the king in to g5 and then chip open the position with h4. And then once if white takes, then he's going to have this pawn on h3 to look after. So you can't defend three weak pawns with two pieces. So what if rook a2? What if not rook a2? What if white just goes for broke and takes on c5? Well, we're taking this for check, and then check on g2, and then takes here. So in this, this is, well, kind of obviously losing for white. Because this pawn is dropping, and then if this pawn drops, we're going to have so many connected passed pawns on the king side. And then the black rook will always be able to get behind the the white's c pawn, which is his only trump in this position, really. If white plays h4 to prevent that, then just it just brings the rook there, and then this pawn can't be defended, and then whenever this pawn pushes, the rook can come here, and you can get rid of this f3 pawn, sure, but it's just, I think just maybe just rook here. Again, sort of holding white to both of these weak pawns, and then with some pushing action. So yes, this looks quite grim for white. So you can't bring the rook off the back rank quite yet. Caruana played g4, which is consistent. Now f takes g4, and then well, white took back in the game. Let's look at some alternatives. Because here's what happened in the game. Let's just show you first of all. White took on g4. And then, I mean, if black were to take back, that would be a blunder, because then he'd have no way of preventing the king from coming to g3. And now both of these pawns would be weak. But no, h4 instead. And the idea here is that these, by taking away not only g2 but also g3, we're creating a prison for white's king on this side of the board here. Let's take a look at what if black were to have taken here. Well, then the king just comes up here, conveniently guarding f2. Can come behind to put pressure on this, but then just taking here, c1, and this rook is very poorly placed in front of the pawn. In fact, you can't go to f1, so that the rook cannot move and still keep touching the f3 pawn. So white on his next move is going to play king g3, and then this rook will have to abandon the support of f3, and then white will just take with equality. So that's why not to do that. Just play h4 here, and then king h2 was played in the game. I guess an option would be to push the pawn to g5 to prevent black's pawn from going to g5. But then black would just come in with his king and chomp that. So that's not it's not really palatable either. So after h4, king h2 was played, and rook d2, again attacking the f2 pawn, and white cannot play king g3 because that square is not available. So he just, instead of taking the f2 pawn, he just goes to king h3 to, counterattack this pawn. But then black plays g5. So this is quite an impressive prison that Carlsen has built for his opponent's king on the side of the board. So white really has no way of activating his king anymore. So Caruana played e4 on move 38. And the idea of e4 is to allow a way for the rook to attack the f3 pawn. And it also sets a trap for black, because if black were to just play rook takes f2, well, the white king is stalemated here. So white gets a perpetual check. So there's no way for black to hide from the checks, because white is just intending to give up his rook. If check, if you come here, then check, and then this is stalemate. So, so the pawn on f2 is taboo, because another thing that the move on e4 accomplished is now these pawns have no moves. So, does Carlsen fall for that? Of course not. He plays rook d4, taking advantage of the last move, e4, which weakened support for the d4 square. So now this rook is just settled in behind white's pawns, and these pawns are all dropping off. So rook a8, king comes to f7, rook a3, threatening the f3 pawn, takes c4, takes f3 check, and it would be a mistake then to come to the king side, because then the king gets cut off from the e6 pawn, and white develops some counterplay. So king e7 instead. So white played rook e3 to defend the e4 pawn. Black stepped aside, preparing to advance his own pawn. And now f3. So this sort of dooms white to passivity, because now there's no way for white's rook to enter through the f file. But I mean, black's c pawn was going to be much too fast anyway for that type of a plan to succeed. So f3 was played. c4. And now this rook is very passively placed behind two of his own pawns, so he improves the position by going out to the side. And then rook d3. So this attacks the weak pawn on f3, also the rook. And if this exchange happens, then the black pawn will come to d3, and white cannot get in the square. So rook's got to move, so he moves for check. King d8. This was the best possible place to move the king, because white was intending to bring the rook behind the pawn. It's usually the best possible defense, but king d8 stops that from happening. So now king g2, trying to bring the king back into the action, but the king turns out to be a liability on the second rank. Carlsen plays c3, and then rook a4 with the idea of going behind the pawn. c2. Now here actually Carlsen did not play the most precise move. Rook d7 is a much easier win, with the idea of simply bringing the rook behind the c pawn. Let's see how this might have ended up. Well, if the rook comes behind the c pawn, then black can just bring his pawn, or his rook, behind the pawn as well. Obviously, any exchange is losing because the king is still outside the square. So rook d4 check, king e7, rook d1, and here it's possible to play c2, rook c1, and then rook c3. This has got to be winning, because black will just bring the king in and win the rook. And white's king can't really go too far, because it's got to worry about this this passed h pawn as well. But instead, rook d7 is a lot cleaner, taking advantage of the fact that the king is on the second rank. It transposes to the winning line that we're going to see after rook a1, so let's just keep that in mind. After rook d7, rook a1 is possible just to immediately get in front of the pawn. c2, rook c1, rook d2 check. And so this is why the king was a liability here, is because if the king now goes to the back rank, then black will have rook d1 check, followed by taking back with pawn or taking the rook. So this type of fork, even though it temporarily leaves the c2 pawn unprotected, because of the check, it forces an immediate win. So instead, it's got to put the king on this terrible spot on h3, and now king d7, and the mean, white's just in Zugzwang here. If the rook moves somewhere, then black plays rook d1 followed by queen. The king has no moves, so white's got to play f4. So now g takes f4, king takes h4, f3. And this is a pretty straightforward win. We're just going to play f2 and then rook d1. And then we're going to be threatening to queen both of these pawns. So yeah, rook d2, c2, rook c4. So rook c4 was, or actually, go back, what happened in the game? Rook c4 was played, and then Carlsen could have played rook d7, but instead he played c2. And this is also winning, but just not nearly as cleanly. Rook c4, then rook d2 check. King has to come back to h3 because of that line we just saw. And king d7. So, white has no good moves here. So, he just plays rook c5. You can't really fault him for that. Rook f2. Again, attacking this pawn there. Rook c3 is not really a defense because black can just take, forking, and f takes, queen. So, white played f4 in the game, and then Carlsen played rook f3 check, which is not necessary. In fact, it's it actually wins quicker to take with the pawn on f4 because of say a line like if he plays g5 here and f3, king g4, h3, threatening to win this pawn. So it gets white to stop touching the f3 pawn, and then rook d2, king g3, 2, king g2, rook d1, again threatening to queen both of these pawns. White can't take both of them. So what if just takes on h4 here? Well, check, and then this is taken away, so the king has to come in front of the pawn, and f3, and again, this is it's a pretty straightforward win here. You're just going to play, f2 and f1. So after f4, Carlsen plays rook f3 check, and this is good enough, because after king h2, rook takes f4. Caruana resigned in this position. Yeah, he takes the c2 pawn, but after rook takes g4, black is essentially up 2 pawns. This king is walled off on the edge, and we've got these this bad structure here. So this position is sufficient to force resignation at the Super GM level. So I hope you enjoyed this this coverage of the endgame between Caruana and Carlsen from their game today. And have a good one.